I didn't think so at first, but the more I've thought about it and the more I've kind of re-examined these episodes, I do think Christopher was an informant when he died. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Serialized. I'm your host, Kino, joined again by Stephanie from Soprano Blueprints, and we are finally here at the end of our journey to go through all the seasons of The Sopranos. We're talking about the final season 6B. It's been really fun to kind of go through the series again with you, Stephanie.
I know, or Tony would say, remember when is the lowest form of conversation, but I don't think so for The Sopranos. I think there's an exception. I think remember when is the highest form of conversation for The Sopranos.
Yeah, I mean, it's really worth it because, like, even going through this, I know I've done my whole Soprano log series. I've talked about the series to death, but even going through this, like, discussing it with you, there's been stuff that we brought up that I haven't thought about before, and it might even lead to future video ideas to examine some of that stuff, because there's always something new you can learn from just going through the series again.
Oh, yeah, that's what I love about the show. Like, even to this day, even if it's an episode that I've watched, like, literally 100 times, I'll still, surprise myself and I'll be like, whoa. I think that's one of the most fun parts about rewatching is you never feel like you're really done.
Absolutely. And I had to say, though, up front, we are not going to do any cut to black jokes at the end of this one. That's like something that's like a cliche, basically, with The Sopranos. When people are talking about the finale and the final episode, they do a cut to black. I did one of those in my Soprano log series, but we're not going to do that because that's been done to death. And instead, we're gonna,
no pun intended.
No pun intended, exactly. But we're gonna talk about a lot of the other stuff that doesn't get brought up as much. But jumping into this first episode here, Soprano Home Movies, episode 13 of the season, we start off on a relatively happy note here. We got Tony dealing with a gun charge, is not so happy. It's a callback to the season 5 finale. We have an alternate take. Actually, it's not the same take that they used in the episode itself, which I always thought was a little interesting that they used an alternate take that's slightly different. Like, what do you make about that? Because it's the scene with Tony and Johnny Sack talking, and then the FBI show up and Tony runs and throws the gun. What do you make about using a slightly different take?
I mean, I think it was an interesting way of sort of transitioning from one season to the next because, of course there were time in between them, but I think it's sort of an interesting way to like almost you're coming back to that same place, but almost from a different perspective, as if you're like almost a person looking from a window, like a different window. But again, because I didn't watch it live, I don't have the advantage of saying how it felt at that moment. But I do think it's interesting how they sort of set it all up. And I think throwing sort of the gun falling in the snow, I think it's pretty symbolic with how they had like, basically the gun like molded in. It was almost like instead of making a snow angel, it's like a gun angel. What about you? What do you think?
I don't know quite what it might just be like, hey, we have 2 takes here. Why don't we use this one? Like I said, there's some weird editing choices in the show that
they did on season one once, I believe, with Denial, Anger, Acceptance, and then the beginning of I Dream of Jeannie Cusimano, where they had like footage of Syl and Polly out front of Satriali's.
It's interesting, like, again, they do some weird editing choices that I don't always know if it means anything or they were just like, whatever, let's just try this. I will say, though, I think that the first take that they have in All Due Respect is better than this take. I think the way that James Gandolfini delivered his lines were better in the original version, which makes sense that they used that take instead. But, besides that gun charge going on here, we have kind of a start to a cozy episode in the sense that, Tony goes up to Bobby and Janice's cabin, celebrate his birthday. It's a nice, kind of summer moment hanging around. It reminded me a little bit of Uncle Pat's farm, where it's like, oh, it's just nice being out in nature. And just like that episode, it kind of turns sour thanks to Tony's emotions.
Yeah, that's a good point about in terms of the overall environment. It almost reminds me a little bit of Marco Polo, too, in the sense of like sort of summer outdoors and, not the same like bullshit agita that they're necessarily usually worrying about. Then, of course, it's like we know just from the very nature of who they are that something's going to come up sooner or later.
Absolutely. And it does in this episode. Tony's kind of, his need to pick on Janice, disrespecting her in front of her husband, which, Bobby has to deal with a lot of disrespect from Tony, but finally it's too much in this episode. He gets a well-deserved beating down for it, and how he punishes him later, which is he makes him do his first hit, which a lot of fans have criticized the fact that there's no way Bobby would have ever been made without having to kill some guy. I just kind of accept it as like, hey, they lampshade it by the fact that Jersey doesn't have like strict standards when it comes to how guys get made. That's one of the points that Phil brings up later. So in real life, would it have gone down that way? Probably not. But we can just accept that in this series, Bobby was the kind of innocent one who never killed a guy, and he's forced to do it here, and kind of Tony forces him to ruin his innocence, so to speak, as punishment for hitting him.
Yeah, it was sad because it's like, Bobby, he didn't have any desire to kill. Like if he was going to kill someone, it would be, out of self-defense or protection. So it was almost, yeah, it was like a really nasty, a very like season 6B type of Tony thing to do, in terms of like really something that, can really get to someone, but without like explicitly saying what you're going to make them do, or why it's so bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same way that he likes to pick on Janice and Bobby because he's her husband. Like he just likes to, he's kind of sadistic a little bit when it comes to them specifically, because of all the pain that Janice kind of put him through when he was younger. I have to say, though, there's a lot of people who kind of theorize that the guy that Bobby kills is Janice's son, Harpo, who is a French Canadian. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I really, really don't think that's it. The guy's credited as Rene Lecours, which I see no reason why they would give him a different name like that. People like to bring up the fact that, he changed his name from Harpo to Hal. And it's like, yeah, but this is a completely different name, a completely different last name. It's if they even just credited him as like French guy or something, I might believe it. But the fact that they gave him a completely different name, it's very clear to me that this is not Janice's son.
To me, it's like, it's one of those things where it's like it's possible, it could be. And I know they, in addition to, of course, the French Canadian, the similar curly hair, but of course it's not something that we could ever actually prove. Like, there's never any resolution to it. There are a couple of clues that we could, if we were going to try to play Nancy Drew, that we could try to, point to and say, oh, this could possibly mean that, this could mean something, but it's not something that, we can state it for sure, because we just don't know for sure. There's never been any resolution of it. And that's sometimes actually one of the criticism that I have sometimes of people, where there's no actual resolution, but people are like sure that they have the one and only true answer. And I'm like, it's an opinion.
Yeah, and it's like when you have a theory, it's on the responsibility is on you to have like evidence for it. Is it possible that this guy is Hal? Sure, but there's nothing in the text, or not text, but like in the episode itself to suggest that it is. And if there's something to suggest it, then there's something to say there's something to say it is Hal. You have to have evidence to make a claim like that, and I don't see it. I think there's more evidence for something like Dr. Russ Fogoli being Paulie's biological father. That there's not full evidence for that, but I think there's more evidence for that than there is for this being Janice's son.
Right, with the prostate cancer, and then the nun, and then how they talked about how Russ was overseas. So, I mean, yeah, but I mean, even with that, there would have to be more evidence. But yeah, I mean, that especially, with the prostate.
It could be, definitely. The last thing I want to bring up before we move on to the next episode here is this is the first introduction of Doc Santoro, who is one of the Lupertazzi capos. He's going to have a little bit of a storyline this season with Phil. I have to say just up front, though, I don't like Doc. I think he's kind of pointless. Like, they introduced this guy who becomes the boss of the family for no reason, just to have Phil take it over a few episodes later. I think it's just kind of a waste of time, and it just ultimately is like a pointless character to me.
Yeah, it seems like they wanted to almost recreate like a hit sort of similar to like in terms of how they hit him outside the restaurant. I almost feel like they were, like he could have been sort of like a placeholder character. Like a bunch of other people could have been Doc Santoro and done it just fine. It seemed to me more like they were trying to recreate some sort of, from scenes of people getting like hit outside of restaurants. And it was more like he was some sort of composite of all of those stories.
Yeah, not a big deal either way, but ultimately it doesn't add up to anything for me. But the next episode here, Stage 5, really good episode here. We have the death of Johnny Sack, dying from lung cancer. It's sad that he took this deal and kind of ruined his reputation with the idea that, like, well, at least I'll get out of prison quicker. And he ends up dying. Yeah, he'll end up dying in there because of his cancer, which, is sad, but he also brought it on himself for all of his actions.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how he was like, I finally quit smoking, started eating right, and for what? And it was like, well, yes, you did that for a few months. You were also smoking for like 40, 50 years. But I think it was really like sweet and kind, and seeing in terms of just how, even though Ginny was upset with him, she still, like, at the end of the day, even by his bedside as he was dying, like, wanted him to be comfortable. So I think it just sort of, and was another illustration of how their powerful love for each other.
We also have the storyline with Christopher's movie finally coming out, Cleaver. He premieres it. People see the similarities between, the story and Tony. And it's sort of a reflection of how much Christopher hates Tony. It's like a revenge fantasy, subconsciously, probably. I don't know if Christopher is, kind of in touch with his emotions enough to understand that. But yeah, we see a real, like, rot between Tony and Christopher it's been bubbling for a while, but we're really seeing it come to the surface here. We'll see it more in some of these other episodes too, but the relationship has just completely broken down over the years, and it's gonna end very violently.
Definitely. One thing that I think was cool, that in Stage 5, when Sil and Jerry Torciano are at their dinner, and then of course that Jerry gets shot, and then Sil makes a comment. I didn't even hear what was happening until after the shot was fired, and it makes me think of the previous Bobby's comment. You probably don't even hear when it happens, right?
I mean, that's very, very much tied to the finale. Like, there's so many details that are weaved throughout the season, which we'll talk about in when we get to the final episode. But it's so, like, I don't understand why people feel the need to argue about the finale. To me, it's like so insanely clear how much David Chase was setting up through all of these episodes, all of the stuff going on here. It makes complete sense to me what he was trying to say about the finale.
And I think it just, we're the audience, we're not prepared for death. So it's like, we're not prepared for death for there either.
No one is. But the ending scene of this episode with the baptism, every baptism scene in movies with Italians always reminds me of Godfather. It's especially with the music playing over. It's not the same type of music, obviously. This is, kind of new age music, but Butch or Phil telling Butch, never again, never going to compromise again. He's setting himself up for, the confrontation we're going to have this season. And I always love that moment with Phil. It's like a very decisive moment for his character.
Oh, absolutely. And the music, it's one of my favorite songs from the Sopranos soundtrack, evidently Chicken Town. I think it really just makes the whole scene even more powerful. Yeah, and it's interesting also when he briefly talks about his weakness. He thinks it's in his DNA. It just reminds me of Tony when he's had his conversations about it's in my blood, it's in my DNA.
Well, the funny thing about Phil, though, and I have a video where I kind of talk about this with Phil. What his actual weakness is his inability to compromise. It's not the fact that he compromises all the time. It's the fact that he is so ardent to tradition and stuff like that ultimately it has no place in the modern world. Like we see this all the time with guys getting out of prison. They're stuck in the past, and
like Feach is another example.
Exactly, yeah. And it's his inability to kind of adapt to the modern age, which is ultimately what's going to set up, his own destruction later on in the season. So I always love that when a character kind of, they sort of misinterpret what is going on with their character.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
The next episode here, Remember When, which, we're doing with this podcast, but we have Tony going to Miami with Paulie. They're laying low after a murder charge, has come up. And again, this is another relationship that's really broken down over the years. It's been going on since the 4th season. That's when we kind of introduced the fact that Paulie is on Tony's bad side, and he sort of manages to get back on it by, paying him off. But there's this real tension that's been bubbling in their relationship this whole time where it, again, almost comes to a head in this episode.
Definitely. And I think, I mean, even I always think that going back really to season one, when Polly tells Sil that he can't get past the fact that Tony was seeing a woman psychiatrist, to me, that was like a red flag in the sense of, him almost suggesting, like, I'm not going to respect Tony as the boss, or like, I'm not going to bend the knee to Tony sort of thing. And then Sil sort of put him in his place. But, again, and then of course it progressively got worse. And then Ralph, and then yeah, that was a suspenseful boat ride.
Yeah, I mean, any kind of boat ride naturally makes you think of what happened to Pussy, and they do a flashback in this episode too with that. But the other storyline happening in this episode is sort of a One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest story with Junior in the assisted living mental institution, whatever you want to call it, home, where he has sort of a sidekick in this kid Carter Chong, again, sort of mirroring a relationship he'd have with Tony, kind of he's like being like a father figure in some ways to this kid who has his own sort of daddy issues. And the fact that the episode ends with this kid turning on Junior, becoming disillusioned with him, again, sort of mirrors like the breakdown in the father-son relationships we see throughout the show.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's really another like powerful song that always gets me is Take Me Home Country Road, the song that's on while he attacks him. It's just, it's very nostalgic for some reason.
Yeah, it's very sad to see how Junior ends in this episode, like basically almost comatose. Like this attack hurts him even more than he was already mentally declining. We see him have some vitality in this episode. He's organizing stuff, but this beatdown he gets, like, further pushes him into dementia. I don't know how that works in real life, but definitely in this one, he's not the same after this. And I don't know. I don't think it's just the physical attack. I think it's also the fact that he's lost this relationship with this kid. He has no real connections with people anymore. And it's just a decline from there. And it's also very sad that we get so few scenes with Dominic this season, but that's, I think, sort of the intention. Like, Tony is sort of lost without, again, this father figure he has in Junior. And the fact that they don't speak at all this season adds to the kind of loneliness that's hanging over season 6B.
Definitely. And then like sort of how the episode ends, sort of like to the drum sound, and then Junior just like sitting there, like very silent with the cat. I always like to think it's Pussy Malanga's ghost.
Again, it's a very, very sad image to see him basically being like a shell of himself there. And, he had the chance to sort of escape at one point, but he ultimately kind of stays. I think that's kind of a commentary on Junior's life that, like all these guys, they had kind of a chance to escape this life, but ultimately they choose their old habits rather than trying to go their own way.
Right. And also just his condition in terms of him, really not being in any state to sort of make his own responsible decisions.
But the next episode here, Chasing It, one of the darker episodes in terms of how it paints Tony as this he's become this very pathetic character. It always reminds me of the flashback with his father, Johnny Boy, where he tells him never to gamble. And he's become a gambling addict in this episode, the same way he kind of looked down on guys like Davey Scatino. He's doing the same thing now. He's chasing the high that gambling brings him. And I think part of his overall like need to keep moving, keep doing stuff rather than reflecting on how his life has led him to this position.
Absolutely. And really things come full circle. If you think about, at the first episode, it was, having to go after this guy who was in debt to Hesh. Now Tony's the one who's in debt to Hesh. Things come full circle in really hypocritical ways like that. But it was unfortunate how he treated Hesh. That whole thing was just,
this season is all about stripping Tony of everything that's good in his life. He's losing his friends. He's going to lose more of them over the course of the show, but he's increasingly isolated as stuff happens this season, which again is why season 6B is probably the most depressing season of the show. I don't think it's as brutal as some of the stuff we saw in season 3, but in terms of like just depressing episodes to watch, it's just like episode after episode after episode of just sad stuff happening that again is kind of taking all the glamour out of the mob life that we've seen the past 6 seasons. We're seeing how it actually ends in gray sadness.
Yeah, and I think that's why I always, when I first watched, I had to like start over from the beginning right away because it was just so depressing at the end. I was like, I need some sunlight.
Yes, exactly. I mean, even color wise, this season is much more muted, a lot more grays, a lot more gray tones. And speaking of the cinematography, there's actually a lot of scenes in this episode specifically that are shot on like shaky cam. I think probably it was held by hand. Again, kind of reflecting the unhinged nature of Tony's psyche in this episode as he's chasing the high of gambling.
Oh yeah, which will come back, of course, in Kennedy and Heidi when he's in Vegas. Also with the when he's literally on peyote, but when he's all over the place in the casino.
And in this episode, we also have Vito Jr., Vito's son, acting out after his father's death. It's interesting. This is the first time we've actually seen sort of the consequences of what happens when one of these guys gets killed. Pussy got killed, and we didn't ever really see what happened with his family besides his wife. But we're seeing that these hits have a horrible effect on the families that are left behind. And I think it makes us think of what's potentially going to happen to Tony's own family if something like this happened to him.
Definitely. And especially sort of the way that they found out about it when they were, thought that their dad was, a spy. And then it's a very sort of stigmatized subject that he hears about. So then it's like on top of just the pain, of losing a parent, it's like there's all this other complicated subjects on top of it.
Yeah, just a brutal episode overall in terms of just how sad everything. AJ loses his fiance in this episode. Again, a lot of sad stuff, and that
Renata, Hesh loses.
Yeah, Renata, Hesh loses. Everyone's losing people in this episode, and it leads into the next one, Walk Like a Man, in which AJ and Christopher are both really dealing with the emotions. Some very strong emotions of sadness in this episode. AJ dealing with depression after Blanca broke up with him, and Christopher essentially realizing that none of these people are his friends. Like they all look down on him for being sober, for his daughter, all of this stuff, and it's no one, not even his friend JT Dolan, actually cares about him.
Right. Well, and I think with JT stuff, because I don't know if it's so much that JT didn't care about him, or I think I guess JT was sort of, he didn't want to enable Christopher at that point. I do think it was probably not a very smart idea for him to sort of say, Chris, you're in the mafia, especially if he knows that Christopher is messed up and then he'd have a gun. But I see what you're saying in terms of, it was very, and it was harsh when he said, I'm pouring my heart out to you, and he said, Chris, you're in the mafia. It's like, okay, that's not really relevant. I'm saying I'm pouring my heart out to you.
Well, I don't think it's fair that Christopher expected JT to be his friend. Like, look how he treated him. He beat him. He took his car. Like, he did all this stuff to him. And then he still expects this guy to be like, yeah, let me pour my heart out to you. It's like, yeah, I sympathize with JT. Like, I wouldn't be friends with Christopher either. And I think Christopher killing him at the end is him, again, just kind of lashing out. It's like he can't take it out on anyone else, so he takes it out on this guy, the one guy he can kind of beat down on.
Oh yeah, exactly. And he's sort of like, fuck it at that point, because he's already he's drunk. He's sort of like, this guy's an asshole, and everyone, he doesn't give a shit about me either, so fuck it.
Yeah, there's some great stuff also with AJ in this episode. I think Tony talking to Melfi about his son and his, rotten putrid genes is one of the best therapy scenes in the entire series. I think AJ hanging out with the two Jasons, at the frat, and then pouring acid on this guy. Again, he like Tony's trying to mold him into the kind of son he wants to be. He wanted, this party boy kid who does stuff like this, kind of like a little mini mobster in his own right, but it clearly is not for AJ. Like this is not who he's meant to be. And even though he's kind of going through the motions with this, it's really hurting his psyche.
Right. I'm not sure that Tony would even want AJ. Like, I think that Tony genuinely likes that, AJ's not in the life. I think he was more in terms of like he wanted to put on a front and like make AJ seem cool and like, oh, he figured out, you go out with the guys and party, like it'll help you get over your ex girlfriend. But yeah, with AJ, I mean, it wasn't making him happy, and I mean, and then we see later on, of course, what ends up, they get in trouble, those guys.
Yeah, no, I don't think he wanted him to be like a criminal, like a mobster, but like
He didn't want him to be sitting at home, that's for sure.
yeah, he wanted him to be like active and like having fun, like being a frat boy like these guys. But again, it doesn't kind of work for AJ. It only makes things worse. I have a real quick note here, which is for some reason, Georgie the bartender has a brief appearance in this episode, despite the fact that he resigned and quit because of what Tony did to him in Cold Cuts. We see him in the background tending bar, which I always thought was a mistake. I don't know why they did it. I don't know why Georgie would kind of come back after everything that happened. They don't say anything, and he just is in the background, but I always thought that was kind of a mistake because Georgie quitting was, again, a very powerful moment that made Tony kind of reflect that, like, oh yeah, I'm a piece of shit to the people around me.
And there are consequences to like my actions. The person who probably has the answer to your question is probably the person who knows who the guy was that's standing in the background at after Jackie Jr.'s funeral and Olivia's wake.
It's not David Chase because he was asked about that. He had no idea what he was talking about. So I have a little note about this, which is I did an episode where I talked about there were a bunch of scripts that were leaked online that had scenes that didn't make it into the final episodes. And one of them was Georgie kind of came back in season 5. He was working for Hesh. And I think this might be a continuation of that. The fact it didn't make it into the final episode, so we never saw it. But I think they brought him back earlier. And again, he's just kind of hanging around again. Ultimately, I think it would have been better if they just kind of kept him out of the show. But I think this might just be playing off of a deleted scene that we never got to see.
Yeah, I have a feeling that's it because yeah, otherwise you'd think like why bring him back just for that if it wouldn't really make sense anyway.
But the next episode here, Kennedy and Heidi, one of the most important episodes of the series. We have Christopher's death. Again, we lose arguably the second kind of lead of the series, not in like the final episode or the penultimate episode. This happens almost about halfway, a little more than halfway through the season. Again, very shocking. Like you're not, and it's very early in the episode too. It's not at the end. It's something that happens, right at the beginning, and a very shocking way for the character to go out with. But I think it works really well because the episode isn't so much about Christopher dying as it is the aftermath of his death and how the characters kind of react to it.
Right, exactly. And Tony's sort of, realization or his, admitting explicitly to Melfi and then out loud when he was on peyote that essentially is doing better without him, as sad as that is to say.
Absolutely. And it's very like him admitting it to Melfi in the dream and like being happy. And even when he tells her the fake version later on that, he's still happy that Christopher's dead. It goes to show you how far Tony's fallen. I mean, this was a kid that he kind of helped raise from a baby. And then again, did Christopher do a lot of stuff to kind of have this coming? Absolutely. But even still, to have him feel nothing for this kid who was like a son to him. Like, remember how broken up he was about Pussy's death, how much that bothered him, even Tony Blundetto to an extent. But after everything that's happened, he's almost gleeful that this guy is dead. And he's even reminding everyone, like, hey, remember what a piece of shit Christopher was when people are trying to, like, honor his memory.
Yeah, he kept mentioning like a couple times in his like very Tony way, like, oh, just see there was a branch it crushed it, almost like trying to rationalize to himself, like, oh, it's a good thing I killed him because, what if Caitlin was in the car sort of situation. And I think also the fact that he, suffocated him, it's like, is very, it was even more personal than if he were to have shot him, like if he did it first. I feel like it just made it a whole other, like it took it to another level of sort of intense and like very, very like low.
And, the fact that Tony sleeps with the stripper who was Christopher's mistress, again, is sort of this kind of domination he's done over Christopher this entire time. It's the same thing that Christopher kind of felt with Adriana, even though nothing technically happened. It's like he's rubbing, dirt in the wounds by sleeping with Christopher's, it's not his wife, obviously, although he does kind of make eyes at Kelly later on in the series. But again, it's sort of like he can't help himself but constantly just take everything Christopher has in life. And I think it's, again, we kind of talked in a few episodes ago about how
Juliana also, I think he was also getting back. I think he was trying to get back at Christopher also for that.
absolutely it was the jealousy there too. But I think it's also part of this larger theme about how the older generations are kind of preying on the younger ones. We saw that with Jackie Jr., with Brendan, with all these kind of younger guys. Are they dumbasses a lot of the time? Absolutely. But I think the older guys are kind of preying on the younger ones here, and it's a cycle we see over and over again throughout the series.
Yeah, definitely.
Tony's realization in this episode, he makes a big deal out of it, but again, he sort of loses it later on. What do you make of his realization? Like, what was the "I get it"? What did that mean to you when he had that revelation?
I think it meant in terms of his realizing that his life, or what at least in that moment, his fortune, basically his life, many of his worries were lifted, his burdens were lifted by Christopher being dead. Of course, there's the very, like immediate sense with the, oh, he, does very well in the betting. So that's, of course, like at that very moment. But in the larger sense, he had to worry that Christopher was going to flip any day. He was just a liability in general with the drugs. Of course, Tony felt insecure with women. So I think that it was more Tony making that realization. And I guess we're used to thinking of someone sort of having a trip and having like a good realization or a good epiphany, but not so much if it's sometimes, someone can have an epiphany about something that makes them more effective, just like similar with Dr. Melfi in therapy. Like it can maybe make someone a better mafia boss. It can maybe make in this case, it made Tony have more clarity about why it was the right thing for him to kill Christopher.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a lot of what has to do with it. I think I think part of it is like he doesn't even understand exactly what he saw. Like he tries to say what it is later on. He kind of can't find the words for it. It's like, I don't know if you've ever had experience, being high or being on psychedelics, and I've only had very limited experience, but I think there's some times where you get like very profound feelings that you often can't explain later on to, like, what did this mean? But you don't know, but you felt something in that moment.
Right, exactly. And then we're, of course, the audience, of course, we try to dissect all of it. So I guess in a way, we may have no idea what the hell he was even talking about.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he talked about how, he had realizations about life and death and all this kind of stuff in Christopher. But I think it's also just, the feeling of a profoundness that drugs can sometimes give. And again, he tries to bring that with him moving forward, just like he tried to bring the every day is a gift moving forward. But he slowly kind of loses it over the series or over the remaining few episodes here. Real quick, though, before we move on to the next one, I have to say, I have come around to the idea that Christopher was a rat. I think there is actually evidence for that now. I didn't think so at first, but the more I've thought about it and the more I've kind of re-examined these episodes, I do think Christopher was an informant when he died.
I think there are signs that are pointing to it. Of course, there's the thing with him wearing, the hat, which is sort of like makes me think of Jack Masserone. I mean, the Cleaver hat. We also know he and Agent Harris had been establishing a rapport after he lost Adriana and was getting more and more sort of in a bad spot with Tony. And then the fact that he also then mentioned it to JT, and he was going on and on about, oh, one phone call and it's over.
Well, he's also in the car ride, he's listening to the soundtrack of The Departed, which is about, a guy who's, secretly working with the police and a guy who's secretly working with the mafia. So and the fact later on the cat staring at the picture, and Tony said a rat died in the wall behind there. I've really come around to the idea that I think they were trying to imply that Christopher was a rat. Again, I know I said earlier that like things have to be kind of confirmed for me to believe them, but I just think there's so many like details like that are kind of pointing towards it that I do think Christopher was a rat.
I think I think it's one of those things where there's definitely there's evidence pointing to it, and whether or not he was, I think that they wanted whether or not David Chase would admit to it or not. I think that they put these things in here for a reason. I don't think like the hat, especially given the fact that they had so much emphasis on Jack Masterno, take your hat off, not worth losing your hair over. And then we see Christopher just all of a sudden wearing this like hat, this cap at night. It's sort of yeah, it was, and then along with the other circumstantial things.
We'll never know, but for me, there's a lot of evidence pointing there. But moving into the next episode here, the Second Coming, we're getting close to the end here. Again, dealing with AJ's depression, all the stuff he's gone through. He's tried to hide it. He's tried to kind of go the different direction, but ultimately he takes an attempt on his own life. And even though it's played kind of darkly comedic how it happens and how kind of stupid he is that he wasn't successfully to do it, very, very touching moment when Tony pulls him out of the pool and is comforting him as he cries. One of the few tender moments we see between father and son.
Definitely, and it sort of also comes full circle with the whole, like when we think of the beginning, he's running into the pool, or slowly getting into the pool in his robe with the ducks. It's all bright and sunny, and this time around, it's jumping into the pool fully dressed to help your son, so that he doesn't die.
We have things heating up between New York and New Jersey in this episode, setting up the war, which is going to, take off next episode. We've got Melfi kind of realizing that her relationship with Tony is at an end here. We got a lot of setup Coco. We got a lot of setup that's going to, things are going to come to a head in the next episode here.
Yep, and Phil's not compromising anymore.
Absolutely not. And again, that's sort of what's going to lead to his own death here. But the next episode here, the Blue Comet, penultimate episode of the series. We have a lot going down here with the war in New York. They make their full move here. We have the death of Bobby. Again, kind of a Godfather-esque hit where, we have the trains going through and everything. And it's a very elaborate sequence here.
Very powerful scene.
Very powerful episode. I mean, there's just so much going on here.
Oh, yeah, it was still getting shot. It was, sort of very, kind of when you think of the penultimate with there being more action, sort of more things, taking place even before the finale. It was kind of, we had Bobby Baclieri, the last man standing. Well, if he was standing, not so much anymore. And interesting, in terms of thinking about theories about Patsy, and then knowing that he was in the car, so it sort of complicates things, I think. For me, at least, when I think about theorizing about his involvement or lack thereof, in terms of whether or not he was involved with the hit on Tony, or I guess what point, if any, he started becoming, siding with New York, just because I feel like he could have gotten easily shot there too.
We have a lot of people who leave this episode. Obviously, Melfi ends their relationship. A lot of people were sort of upset by how anticlimactic their relationship ends, where she just stops being his therapist. I think it kind of makes sense when we think about like we've been addressing the fact that the therapy really hasn't been going anywhere for a long time. If anything, it's made him worse to an extent. And I think her finally realizing that and ending things, it's all this whole season 6B is about taking things away from Tony. This is the last time we'll see like Artie Bucco and Charmaine. They're not in the final episode. Again, it's the isolation that Tony's feeling as he's becoming increasingly cornered with mob war on one side and the FBI on the other.
Yeah, and it's definitely, it's just everything. I think it's like the ultimate gray, and then how like when we start the finale, like everything's black. This is like we have this very dark shade of gray when I think of just the Blue Comet and sort of everything that happens. With Melfi, I think the one thing that I don't like is the fact that she knew that he was sort of in crisis, especially given the fact with her sensitivity to suicide and suicide issues. To then, I think, dismiss him like that outright right after his son got into the hospital for a suicide attempt. I think I get that she, had that strong sort of realization, but I think, she probably could have done a better job. But I guess there's no real good time to break up with their patient. But it just seemed a little bad timing wise, just based on the whole thing with AJ.
Yeah, but I think she realizes that Tony's still kind of bullshitting around. Like he's talking about, his emotions, but not really feeling things. And the fact that he stole that thing
That's
from a
true.
newspaper. It's just like it wasn't going anywhere, and they all kind of knew it.
That's true. It may have been just been whether or not the thing happened with AJ. It would have been something else. It wouldn't.
Yeah, but the next episode here we'll talk about Made in America, the final episode. I mean, there's just so much in this episode. Obviously, the resolution to the war. Phil dies. His guys, leave him again because he ultimately kind of left them to handle all the problems, and so they kind of naturally turned on him.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because Butchie back in 6A, he was let's go full on war, wipe him off the planet, and then now Butchie's seeming to be the reasonable one. But yeah, it's come it's all come to a head now. But it's interesting that the finale sit down. Also, I feel with Carmine, there's so much to talk about with the finale. It's so easy to like go off on a tangent.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much here. Obviously, Agent Harris helping Tony with the war, compromising his relationship with the FBI. I think that's an interesting place for him to be, and it's kind of a statement about where law enforcement is going with the war on terror. We have Carlo becoming an informant, and again, the hammer is really coming down where it's like, yeah, charges are coming against Tony. No matter what happens, whether it's the mob war that takes him out or it's the FBI, it's like things are coming to a head. It's his world he's in a corner and his world is rapidly kind of shrinking in on him.
And Carmela's pretty checked out too. I think mentally by that point. I mean, like they illustrate it very well when they're at Vesuvio and they show her just sitting in a chair by herself. But then also just even she's meeting with carpenters. She's not going to cook. I think she's just sort of her priorities because I think she's resigned to the fact that that's what's going to happen to Tony. So I think she's sort of mentally trying to prepare herself for that by sort of detaching herself.
One of the most powerful moments in the series is Tony's final meeting with Junior. Again, we feel his absence this whole season, the fact that they haven't spoken in an entire season. And this last conversation with them is just so powerful. The tears in Tony's eyes as he realizes this man that he's both hated and loved is now gone. Very powerful scene, very sad scene too.
Absolutely. And it kind of makes me think of Tony's thing, if all this shit's for nothing, why do I got to think about it? After he says, you two ran North Jersey. We did. That's nice. It's kind of like, for all that shit they went through, all the fighting, all the war, all the nastiness, like at the end of the day, what did it lead to?
And then we could talk about the final moments here. Let me just start off by asking you, what do you think the ending meant?
I think that, the most realistic or likely scenario would be, Tony getting shot. But, of course, there, on the other hand, maybe he had a panic attack and was blacking out, or maybe it was the FBI, or maybe it was just Meadow and they just went home from Olson's after that. I think that the most likely scenario would be, he got shot and you probably don't even hear it when it happens. And that's what the cut to black was. There are also some folks who think that the finale was actually a dream and that Tony was killed at the end of the penultimate episode. And there's sort of things that they suggest make it a dream, which I think it's interesting because it's one of those many things on The Sopranos that there's no definitive answer to, but it's sort of fun to just like play around with little clues and think about. So I think it's it's sort of a continuous journey for the audience, and I guess pun sort of intended. But I think it's about life and death, and sort of you probably don't even hear it when it happens. When you're born, you're not really realize you're being born. We don't remember anything, and then when you die.
Yeah, I mean, it's been talked about to death. Like we've listed out all the stuff already. Like everyone kind of knows like all the details, but you don't hear when it happens. The bell ringing, just like the door to the restaurant opening and closing.
And on the boat, remember when that?
Yes, exactly. The guy in the members only jacket connected to Eugene. The two black guys in there, which is kind of how hits have been set up in the past.
Unidentified black males.
Absolutely. Even the episode opens with Tony looking like he's in his coffin.
In a casket. Yeah.
It's so clearly set up that he dies at the end here. I even talked about this. There's a picture in the restaurant that looks like the house that Tony sees in his coma dream. Again, symbolizing death. And it's at his 3 o'clock there. The guy, coming out of the bathroom with the gun, just like the Godfather. There's just so many details to me that set up that, like, yes, he died. I don't know why it's controversial. I don't know why I think people just like to be contrarians about it, but it's so obvious to me it almost doesn't even require conversation at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's something it'll be talked about to death, which is fun, right? Because I know it's something you and I spend a lot of time on, but I think it's interesting, and I think it sort of makes you think about different philosophical ideas and themes, and even just like, I think because death is in many ways such a taboo thing, it's like not even something that people can have a consensus on, because it's like agreeing on it would be almost like admitting its existence, and like the idea of it just it all just gets washed away, like Carmela says. But I think that's sort of a theme that we see from the beginning.
Absolutely. And we talked about this all the way back in the first season, that there's so many connections between this episode and the season 1 finale. The fact that Tony doesn't remember his advice of remember the good times shows you just how far he's fallen. I mean, there's just so many parallels between the beginning of the series and the end of it here.
Absolutely. In college, the episode where Tony and Meadow are at dinner, and he says, Jesus right under my nose, you think you know, and Meadow says, no, Dad, you won't. It also kind of reminds me of later on in Holston's, or just sort of, you probably don't even hear when it happens.
Well, it's interesting. The very first shot of the series is that statue, and it's framed as if Tony's looking at the statue, the woman statue
right.
in the therapist's
it's
office.
Between her legs almost.
Exactly. Well, does it open with him between her legs, or does it open with him with just the shot of the woman? Let me pull it. I'm going to pull it up right now.
I could have sworn that it opened with that, but now I'm thinking, because I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of the woman. I thought it opened right with him, like it went from the black and like open, because I was thinking in my head like it's basically like someone's being born.
Okay, you're right. It is. I just pulled it up right here. It is him between the legs, but not counting that, we do cut to a shot looking at the statue, and it's framed as if we're seeing from Tony's eyes looking at the female statue, which is obviously meant to be his mother.
Yeah, so I think it all ties together. So I think you're right in the sense it's definitely like it's emphasizing sort of this mother figure.
The final shot here of cut to black is for me meant to be Tony's perspective. We're seeing through his eyes how it ends when you die, basically. My one question is, I don't quite remember, do we have any mention of Livia in this final episode?
We do. So when Tony and Carmela, I believe they go to therapy with AJ, and then his therapist says, he's mentioned your grandmother, and then Tony actually then starts talking about himself, says, well, my mother, I didn't have a happy childhood, and then Carmela always has this look of like, oh, you're making it about you.
Yeah, so to me, it all kind of connects back on itself here. I think talking about just the cut to black as if it's a cheap gimmick, I think is doing a disservice to the finale, which to me is one of the most perfect finales. I think Mad Men's finale might work a little bit better for me, but again, that's just because Matt Weiner is standing on David Chase's shoulders. But this is still, one of the most perfect finales for me, where it ties everything thematically back onto itself. Do all the plot things get tied up together? No, but I think that's intentional.
Remind me, you haven't seen the Six Feet Under finale, as the series finale is. I'd say it's one of the best.
You told me when we did our live event, I told you I was watching 6 Feet Under. You told me to check that out, and so I have to be honest, I sort of gave up on 6 Feet Under about halfway through. I really wasn't loving it. I can see why people enjoy it. It just wasn't quite for me. But I did go watch the finale, and again, some people might say you're cheating because you didn't see the rest of it. But I understood where they were coming from here, and I think that, again, sort of playing off of stuff like this, sort of wrapping up everything here. You're dealing with death, which that series was all about death too. So I totally get what you mean. Obviously, we're not gonna spoil 6 Feet Under here, but
Right. But I do get what you mean though in terms of because it took me 2 attempts. Like I first started watching it in like 2022, like, and I only watched the first 2 seasons, and then just this last year I was like, oh, I'm gonna just finish the rest of it. So I totally get it. It's very dark, so it's not something that I'd be like, oh, I'm gonna rewatch it a lot.
not I don't condemn the series or anything. I think it is good. It's just it wasn't quite for me, but I can see the appeal. But in terms of, like I said, this finale, I think it's a reason why it's talked about all this time. I think there's just so much artistry and intent that went into this finale. One of 2 episodes that was actually directed by David Chase. He directed the first episode and the last. It's a shame he didn't get to direct The Many Saints. Hopefully that might have made it a better film overall. But yeah, everything's in here for me. It all works perfectly.
Yeah, I think, and it does a great job of also the things that it doesn't tie up, which I think, yeah, it is very purposeful. We don't get that satisfaction of knowing how everything ends up, as is life.
That's his life, and thus we have talked about the whole series here, which is really awesome. Seven full episodes of us discussing the show. I wanted to take the opportunity to just thank you for joining me on this. I know this was a huge commitment on your part to record these, so thank you so much. It's been very fun revisiting the series with you.
Absolutely. I'm always happy to chat Sopranos. Thank you for having me.
And before we go, can you give a shout out again to where people can find you? Plug your stuff here. So if anyone wants to check out Stephanie's stuff, this is where you can find her.
Sure. So YouTube, you can find me at youtube.com/Sopranos Blueprint. You can also go to my blog, sopranosblueprint.com. I do a weekly Sopranos trivia there, as well as other posts, memes, etc. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook also, Sopranos Blueprint, and then Twitter at S Rosendorf 1014, Instagram at S Rosendorf Diaz, and then you can find a couple of other links on my YouTube description. But please feel free to reach out. Let's connect. I'd love to talk Sopranos or even other HBO series. And I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, we appreciate you being here. Definitely go check out Stephanie's stuff. She's one of the best Sopranos content creators out there, which is why I was so excited to have her be the first kind of guest on this podcast. Thank you all so much for listening to this. I hope you've enjoyed this. We're going to continue to break down more series in the future. So be sure to subscribe, continue listening wherever you're listening to this, and we will talk to you guys soon.